Whispers of the Pacific. The Pacific Ocean stretches endlessly before us tonight, a vast expanse of water that holds within its depths some of the most pivotal moments in human history. Picture, if you will, the early morning hours of June 4th, 1942. The sun has not yet risen over these waters, and beneath the surface of what appears to be an empty ocean, the fate of nations hangs in the balance. You might imagine that such a massive body of water would dwarf any human conflict, and in many ways you would be right. The Pacific covers more than 63 million square miles, its deepest trenches plunging to depths that would swallow Mount Everest whole. Yet on this particular morning, in a relatively small patch of ocean northwest of the Hawaiian Islands, the course of World War II, and perhaps the entire 20th century, was about to be decided. The Battle of Midway did not begin with the roar of aircraft engines or the thunder of naval guns. It began months earlier, in quiet rooms filled with the gentle clicking of typewriters and the soft rustle of paper. In the basement of the 14th Naval District headquarters in Pearl Harbor, a small group of codebreakers worked tirelessly to unlock the secrets of Japanese naval communications. These men and women, for there were women among them, though their contributions would remain largely unrecognized for decades, possessed perhaps the most valuable intelligence asset of the entire war. They had cracked the Japanese naval code designated JN-25. Through painstaking analysis of intercepted radio transmissions, they had learned that the Japanese were planning a massive operation against a target they called AF. Commander Joseph Rochefort, the brilliant cryptanalyst who led this effort, suspected that AF was Midway Island, but suspicion was not enough, not when the stakes were this high. So Rochefort devised an elegant test. He had Midway's radio operators send an uncoded message reporting that their water purification system had broken down. Within days, Japanese intercepts reported that AF was short of fresh water. The confirmation sent ripples through the highest levels of American command. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet from his headquarters in Pearl Harbor, now knew not only where the Japanese would strike, but approximately when. The intelligence indicated that Admiral Yamamoto's combined fleet would approach Midway in early June, with a force so overwhelming that it seemed to guarantee Japanese victory. On paper, the odds were staggering. Yamamoto commanded 11 battleships, 8 aircraft carriers, 22 cruisers, 65 destroyers, and 21 submarines. Against this armada, Nimitz could muster no battleships. They still lay broken at the bottom of Pearl Harbor, just 3 aircraft carriers, 8 cruisers, and 15 destroyers. But Nimitz possessed something more valuable than steel and guns. He possessed knowledge. He knew where Yamamoto was going, and he knew when he would arrive. In the vast chess game of naval warfare, this intelligence was worth more than a dozen battleships. As dawn approaches in our story, a lone PBY Catalina flying boat drones through the morning sky, its crew scanning the horizon for any sign of the approaching Japanese fleet. The Catalina's engines produce a steady, hypnotic rhythm, a sound that would become the heartbeat of the coming battle. Below, the Pacific stretches in all directions, its surface painted in shades of deep blue and silver by the rising sun. The pilot adjusts his course slightly, following a search pattern that has been carefully calculated to maximize their chances of spotting the enemy. In the distance, Midway Island appears as little more than a speck on the horizon, a tiny outpost of American territory, barely 2 miles across, sitting alone in the immensity of the Pacific. Island on alert. Midway Island in June of 1942 was a study in contrasts, a place where the ancient rhythms of nature intersected with the urgent demands of modern warfare. The island's most numerous residents were not the 1,200 American servicemen stationed there, but rather the hundreds of thousands of seabirds that had made Midway their home for countless generations. Laysan albatrosses, with their magnificent 7-foot wingspans, soared effortlessly above the coral runways where American fighters and bombers prepared for battle. The birds seemed oblivious to the tension that gripped their human neighbors, continuing their age-old patterns of fishing, nesting, and raising their young as they had done long before the first human ever set foot on these remote shores. The island itself was a testament to American ingenuity and determination. What had once been little more than a refueling stop for trans-Pacific flights had been transformed into a vital military outpost. Engineers had carved runways from the coral, built fuel storage tanks, and erected the radio towers and radar installations that would prove so crucial in the coming battle. Major Floyd Parks, the Marine commander responsible for Midway's defense, walked the perimeter of his small domain in the pre-dawn darkness. He knew, as did every man under his command, that Japanese forces were approaching. The intelligence reports had been clear and terrifying. Parks commanded fewer than 2,000 Marines and Navy personnel, along with a modest collection of aircraft that included some of the most obsolete planes still in American service. His fighters were primarily F-2A Brewster Buffaloes, aircraft that had already proven woefully inadequate against the nimble Japanese Zero. His bombers included a handful of B-26 Marauders and B-17 Flying Fortresses, along with some ancient Vindicator dive bombers that the pilots had nicknamed wind indicators for their tendency to be blown about by crosswinds. Yet Parks and his men were determined to make the Japanese pay dearly for Midway. They had spent weeks preparing defensive positions, dispersing aircraft, and stockpiling ammunition. Every man knew his role in the defense plan, and every man understood that there would be no retreat. Midway was too far from any other American base. If they could not hold the island, they would likely not survive to fight another day. The island's radar operators maintained their vigilant watch from a small concrete building near the airfield. The radar itself was primitive by later standards, a bulky, temperamental device that required constant adjustment and interpretation. But in the hands of skilled operators, it could detect incoming aircraft at ranges of up to 150 miles. Precious minutes that could mean the difference between life and death. As the sun climbed higher, the normal routines of military life continued with an almost surreal normalcy. Cooks prepared breakfast in the mess halls, mechanics performed their morning inspections of aircraft, and radio operators maintained contact with Pearl Harbor and the approaching American fleet. Yet beneath this veneer of routine activity, everyone could feel the tension building like the pressure before a tropical storm. The island's hospital staff prepared for casualties, laying out surgical instruments and checking their supplies of blood plasma and morphine. The chaplain held an early morning service, his words carrying across the small island on the gentle trade winds. There was something profoundly moving about this scene. These young men, far from home, preparing to face overwhelming odds with quiet courage and determination. Perhaps most remarkably, the famous Hollywood director John Ford was present on Midway, having arrived just days earlier with a small film crew. Ford had volunteered for active duty in the Navy and had been assigned to document the battle for the folks back home. He set up his cameras in strategic locations around the island, not knowing that he was about to capture some of the most dramatic footage of the entire war. The birds continued their ancient routines, seemingly unaware that their peaceful island was about to become the center of one of the most decisive battles in naval history. Frigate birds soared overhead, their keen eyes scanning the waters for fish, while red-footed boobies tended to their nests in the low shrubs that dotted the island's interior. Rising sun on the horizon. 400 miles to the northwest, a different kind of preparation was taking place aboard the aircraft carriers of the Japanese mobile force. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the same commander who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, stood on the bridge of his flagship, the carrier Akagi, watching as his flight deck crews prepared for what they expected to be another decisive victory. The confidence aboard the Japanese ships was palpable. These were the same pilots and crews who had swept across the Pacific in an unprecedented string of victories. They had struck Pearl Harbor, conquered the Philippines, captured the Dutch East Indies, and driven the British from Southeast Asia. To them, the coming attack on Midway seemed like just another step in Japan's inevitable march to total victory in the Pacific. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Japan's naval strategy, had conceived the Midway operation as the decisive blow that would force the United States to negotiate a peace settlement. Yamamoto understood, perhaps better than any other Japanese leader, that Japan could not win a prolonged war against America's industrial might. His strategy was to inflict such devastating losses on the U.S. Pacific Fleet that American public opinion would demand an end to the fighting. The plan was complex, involving multiple task forces approaching Midway from different directions. Nagumo's carrier force would strike the island first, neutralizing its air defenses and softening up the garrison. Then Admiral Nobutake Kondo's invasion force would land troops to capture the island. Meanwhile, Yamamoto himself would wait with the main battle fleet, ready to destroy any American naval forces that dared to challenge the operation. On the flight deck of the carrier Kaga, mechanics made final adjustments to the engines of Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers. These aircraft, known to the Allies as Kates, had proven devastatingly effective against the battleships at Pearl Harbor. Their pilots were among the most experienced in the world, veterans of campaigns stretching from China to Ceylon. The atmosphere aboard the Japanese carriers was one of professional competence mixed with supreme confidence. These men had never known defeat, had never even faced serious opposition. The few American counterattacks they had encountered had been easily brushed aside. Why should Midway be any different? Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the first wave of attackers at Pearl Harbor, was aboard Akagi, though he was grounded due to an appendectomy. As he watched the preparations for the Midway strike, he felt the same sense of anticipation that had gripped him 6 months earlier. The American Pacific Fleet had been crippled at Pearl Harbor. Surely what remained could not stand against the might of the combined fleet. The Japanese pilots gathered in their ready rooms for final briefings, studying photographs of Midway's defenses and reviewing their attack assignments. They expected to encounter some resistance. Intelligence reports indicated that the Americans had reinforced the island's garrison and brought in additional aircraft. But Japanese intelligence had seriously underestimated both the strength of Midway's defenses and the proximity of American naval forces. This intelligence failure would prove to be one of the most crucial factors in the coming battle. While the Americans knew almost exactly where the Japanese were and what they planned to do, Yamamoto and his commanders operated under the assumption that the nearest American carriers were thousands of miles away, still licking their wounds from earlier defeats. As the morning progressed, the Japanese carriers turned into the wind and began launching their first strike against Midway. 108 aircraft, 36 Nakajima B-5N bombers, 36 Aichi D-3A dive bombers, and 36 Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters roared off the flight decks and formed up for the attack. The sight was magnificent and terrible, a perfectly coordinated display of naval aviation at its peak. The remaining aircraft on the Japanese carriers were armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, ready to strike any American ships that might appear. But as the morning wore on and no reports came in of American naval forces in the area, Nagumo began to consider rearming these aircraft with high-explosive bombs for a second strike against Midway Island. This decision, to rearm or not to rearm, would soon become one of the most fateful choices in naval history. The first strike. At 5:34 a.m., the radar operators on Midway detected the incoming Japanese strike force while it was still 150 miles away. The warning klaxons immediately began their urgent wailing across the island, sending Marines and sailors scrambling to their battle stations. In the space of just a few minutes, the peaceful morning calm was shattered by the sounds of engines starting, guns being loaded, and aircraft launching into the dawn sky. Major Parks had drilled his men for this moment countless times, but nothing could fully prepare them for the reality of facing the most experienced naval aviators in the world. The island's fighter squadron, VMF 221, launched every available aircraft, 26 fighters in total, including 20 of the obsolete F-2A Buffalo fighters and 6 of the newer F-4F Wildcats. Captain John Carey led the Buffalo fighters into the sky, knowing full well that his aircraft were outclassed by the Japanese Zeros in almost every category. The Buffalo was slower, less maneuverable, and more lightly armed than its Japanese opponent. But Carey and his pilots were determined to sell their lives dearly, to break up the Japanese formation and give the island's anti-aircraft gunners a better chance. The two forces met approximately 30 miles northwest of Midway at 6:16 a.m. What followed was a one-sided slaughter that demonstrated just how completely the Zero dominated American fighters in the early stages of the Pacific War. The Japanese pilots, led by Lieutenant Masaharu Suganami, tore through the American formation with devastating efficiency. Within minutes, 15 of the 26 American fighters had been shot down. Captain Carey's Buffalo disintegrated under the guns of a Zero, sending the squadron commander plummeting into the Pacific. Of the 11 American fighters that survived the encounter, most were so badly damaged that they would never fly again. But the sacrifice of VMF-231 was not in vain. The surviving Japanese bombers and dive bombers continued toward Midway, but they were now scattered and flying in loose formation rather than the tight, coordinated attack pattern they had planned. This disruption would prove crucial in the minutes to come. On Midway itself, every anti-aircraft gun on the island opened fire as the Japanese aircraft approached. The sky filled with black puffs of exploding shells, creating a deadly gauntlet that the attackers had to navigate. The Marines manning these guns were mostly young men who had never seen combat before, but they served their weapons with a steady determination that impressed even the veteran Japanese pilots. John Ford and his camera crew took position in a concrete bunker near the airfield, their cameras rolling as the attack began. Ford himself was wounded by shrapnel during the bombing, but he continued filming, capturing footage that would later win an Academy Award and bring the reality of the Pacific War home to American audiences. The Japanese attack was devastating but not decisive. Bombs cratered the runways and destroyed several buildings, including the mess hall, the post exchange, and parts of the hospital. Fuel storage tanks erupted in towering columns of black smoke, and several aircraft were destroyed on the ground. But the island's vital installations, the radar station, the radio transmitters, and most importantly, the runways themselves, remained operational. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, leading the Japanese strike, circled the island after the attack to assess the damage. What he saw convinced him that a second strike would be necessary to completely neutralize Midway's defenses. At 7:00 a.m., he radioed back to Admiral Nagumo aboard the Akagi, "There is need for a second attack wave." This message would prove to be one of the most significant radio transmissions of the entire war. Aboard the Japanese carriers, Nagumo faced a difficult decision. His second wave of aircraft was armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, ready to attack any American ships that might appear. But if he was to launch a second strike against Midway, these weapons would need to be replaced with high-explosive bombs suitable for attacking land targets. The process of rearming aircraft was time-consuming and dangerous. Torpedoes and bombs had to be lowered into the ship's magazines, while other ordnance was brought up from below decks. During this process, the flight decks would be cluttered with weapons and fuel lines, making the carriers extremely vulnerable to attack. At 7:15 a.m., Nagumo made his decision. He ordered his crews to begin rearming the second wave for another attack on Midway. It seemed like a reasonable choice. There had been no reports of American naval forces in the area, and clearly Midway needed to be hit again before the invasion could proceed. But even as Japanese ordnance crews began the dangerous work of switching weapons on the crowded flight decks, American search planes were reporting the location of Nagumo's carriers to Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding Task Force 16 from the carrier Enterprise. The trap that had been set months earlier by the codebreakers was about to snap shut. The defenders of Midway had bought precious time with their blood. Though they had been overwhelmed by superior numbers and equipment, their resistance had disrupted Japanese plans and forced Nagumo into a fateful decision. In the cruel mathematics of war, their sacrifice was about to pay dividends that none of them could have imagined. As smoke continued to rise from the burning installations on Midway, the island's surviving aircraft prepared for their own desperate mission. Every bomber that could still fly was being readied for an attack on the Japanese carriers. It would be a suicide mission for most of the crews involved, but it was their only chance to strike back at the enemy before the invasion began. Turning of the tide. 240 miles northeast of Midway, Admiral Raymond Spruance stood in the flag plot of the USS Enterprise, studying the latest intelligence reports with the calm precision that would make him one of America's greatest naval commanders. At 55, Spruance was older than many of his peers, a thoughtful, methodical officer who approached naval warfare like a complex mathematical problem. The intelligence was both encouraging and terrifying. The Japanese carriers had been located, but they were launching aircraft for what appeared to be a second strike on Midway. This meant that American forces had a narrow window of opportunity, perhaps just minutes, to catch the enemy carriers while their flight decks were crowded with aircraft, fuel lines, and ordnance. Spruance made a decision that would be studied in naval academies for generations to come. Rather than wait for his aircraft to form up in proper attack formation, he would launch everything immediately and let the different squadrons find the enemy independently. It was a risky gamble, Scattered attacks were less effective than coordinated strikes, but speed was more important than coordination. At 7:02 a.m., the Enterprise began launching aircraft. 37 SBD Dauntless dive bombers, 14 TBD Devastator torpedo planes, and 10 F-4F Wildcat fighters roared off the flight deck in rapid succession. Simultaneously, the carrier Hornet was launching her own strike force of 35 dive bombers, 15 torpedo planes, and 10 fighters. The TBD Devastator was already obsolete by 1942 standards. A slow, lumbering aircraft that had to approach its targets at low altitude and straight and level flight to deliver its torpedoes. The pilots who flew these planes knew they were flying death traps, but they climbed into their cockpits with grim determination. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, leading Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet, had told his men before takeoff, "If there is only one plane left to make a final run-in, I want that man to go in and get a hit." The American strike forces flew west toward the reported position of the Japanese carriers, but navigation over the featureless Pacific was a constant challenge. Radio silence had to be maintained to avoid alerting the enemy, so the scattered squadrons had no way to coordinate their movements or share information about the enemy's location. Torpedo Squadron 8 was the first to find the Japanese carriers at approximately 9:20 a.m. Waldron's 15 TBD Devastators approached the enemy fleet at wave-top height, their torpedoes armed and ready. What they found was a concentration of enemy ships unlike anything they had ever seen. 4 aircraft carriers surrounded by a screen of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, experienced Zero pilots flying high above their fleet, dove on the approaching torpedo planes with murderous efficiency. The Devastators, flying straight and level at 120 miles per hour, were sitting ducks. One by one, they were shot down or crashed into the sea, their crews lost in the vast Pacific. Of the 15 aircraft in Torpedo Squadron 8, only one survived the attack. Ensign George Gay's plane was shot down just short of the Japanese fleet, but Gay himself survived, floating in his life jacket among the wreckage and watching the battle unfold around him. He would be the sole survivor of his squadron and the only American witness to see the entire battle from water level. Torpedo Squadron 6 from the Enterprise arrived shortly after and suffered a similar fate. 14 TBD Devastators approached the Japanese carriers from a different angle, but the result was the same. Zero fighters and anti-aircraft fire from the ships below created a deadly crossfire that no slow-moving torpedo plane could survive. 10 of the 14 aircraft were shot down, and those that survived failed to score any hits. By 10 o'clock a.m., it appeared that the American counterattack had failed completely. 35 of the 41 torpedo planes launched that morning had been shot down, and not a single torpedo had found its target. The Japanese carriers continued to operate normally, their flight decks busy with preparations for the second strike on Midway. But the sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons had accomplished something that their crews would never know. By attacking at low altitude, they had drawn the Japanese Combat Air Patrol down to sea level, leaving the high-altitude approaches to the carriers temporarily undefended. And at that crucial moment, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's dive bombers from the Enterprise appeared overhead. McCluskey had been searching for the Japanese fleet for over an hour, his fuel running dangerously low. He had followed a Japanese destroyer that was racing north to rejoin the fleet, and at 10:22 a.m. he spotted the enemy carriers spread out below him like toys on a blue carpet. The scene that greeted McCluskey was a dive bomber pilot's dream. The Japanese carriers were in the middle of launching aircraft for the second Midway strike, their flight decks crowded with planes, fuel lines, and ordnance. The carriers Kaga and Akagi were particularly vulnerable, their decks packed with aircraft that had just been rearmed with high-explosive bombs for the land attack. McCluskey split his force, leading one group against the Kaga, while Lieutenant Richard Best took his squadron after the Akagi. The SBD Dauntless was not a particularly fast or maneuverable aircraft, but it was ruggedly built and equipped with an excellent bomb sight. More importantly, American dive bomber pilots had trained extensively in the months following Pearl Harbor, practicing their attacks until they could place their bombs with deadly accuracy. At 10:26 a.m., the first American bombs began to fall on the Japanese carriers. Lieutenant Best's 1,000-pound bomb struck the Akagi near the center of her flight deck, detonating among the aircraft and ordnance that were spotted for takeoff. The explosion triggered a chain reaction of secondary blasts as aviation fuel and ammunition cooked off in the intense heat. Simultaneously, McCluskey's dive bombers were pounding the cargo with devastating effect. Multiple bomb hits turned the carrier's flight deck into an inferno, trapping hundreds of sailors below decks and making any attempt at damage control nearly impossible. The third Japanese carrier, Soryu, was attacked by dive bombers from the Yorktown just minutes later. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie led his squadron in a perfectly coordinated attack that left the Soryu burning from stem to stern. In the span of just 6 minutes, from 10:22 to 10:28 a.m., 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers had been reduced to burning hulks. The same ships that had struck Pearl Harbor, that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months, were now dying in the waters off Midway. The price of victory. The transformation of the battle was so sudden and complete that it seemed almost impossible to believe. At 10:20 a.m., the Japanese had appeared to be on the verge of another decisive victory. By 10:30 a.m., 3/4 of their carrier force was burning and sinking beneath the Pacific swells. Aboard the stricken Japanese carriers, scenes of incredible heroism and tragedy were playing out simultaneously. On the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo's staff officers had to physically drag their commander from the bridge as flames engulfed the ship's superstructure. The admiral who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor was now watching his fleet die around him, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. Captain Taijiro Aoki of the Kaga remained at his post until the very end, refusing to abandon ship until every possible survivor had been evacuated. When the carrier finally rolled over and sank, Aoki went down with his ship, maintaining the ancient tradition of the sea even as his world collapsed around him. The human cost of these few minutes was staggering. Each of the Japanese carriers had carried a crew of over 1,500 men, plus the pilots and aircrew of their embarked squadrons. Many were trapped below decks when the bombs hit, killed instantly by the explosions or suffocated by the toxic smoke that filled the ship's compartments. But perhaps the greatest loss was not in men, but in experience. The Japanese pilots who died in the flames of their carriers represented years of training and combat experience that could never be replaced. These were the men who had perfected the techniques of carrier aviation, who had struck Pearl Harbor and swept across the Pacific in an unprecedented string of victories. The 4th Japanese carrier, Hiryu, had been operating separately from the other 3 and initially escaped the American attack. Her captain, Tomeo Kaku, was determined to strike back at the Americans while he still had the chance. At 11 o'clock a.m., 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters launched from the Hiryu's deck, heading northeast toward the reported position of the American carriers. The target they found was the USS Yorktown, the same carrier that had been heavily damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea just a month earlier. The ship had been repaired in an incredible 72-hour effort at Pearl Harbor, with work crews laboring around the clock to get her back into action. Now she would face her second major battle in 5 weeks. The Japanese attack on the Yorktown was expertly executed, a reminder that even in defeat, the Imperial Navy remained a formidable opponent. 3 bomb hits damaged the carrier's flight deck and started fires throughout the ship. For a time, it appeared that the Yorktown might be lost, but her damage control parties worked miracles, getting the fires under control and restoring power to the ship's engines. The Yorktown's reprieve was temporary. A second strike from the Hiryu, this one consisting of torpedo planes, found the carrier just as she was getting back underway. 2 torpedo hits in quick succession doomed the gallant ship, forcing her crew to abandon ship as she listed heavily to port. Captain Elliot Buckmaster was the last man to leave the Yorktown, following the same naval tradition that Captain Aoki had observed aboard the Kaga. As Buckmaster climbed down a rope into a waiting life raft, he could see his ship settling deeper into the water, her flight deck awash and her island superstructure tilted at a crazy angle. The loss of the Yorktown was a heavy blow to American morale, but it could not overshadow the magnitude of the victory that was unfolding. The remaining American carriers, Enterprise and Hornet, launched a final strike against the Hiryu in the late afternoon. 24 dive bombers found the last Japanese carrier just before sunset, their bombs turning her flight deck into the same kind of inferno that had consumed her sister ships. By nightfall on June 4th, all four Japanese carriers were either sunk or sinking. The mighty mobile force that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months had been destroyed in a single day. Admiral Yamamoto, following the battle from his flagship hundreds of miles away, was forced to face the unthinkable. His carefully planned operation had not only failed, it had resulted in the destruction of the core of Japan's naval aviation capability. The human stories from that terrible day would be told and retold for generations. There was Ensign George Gay, floating alone in the Pacific and watching the battle rage around him until he was finally rescued the next day. There were the pilots of the Enterprise and Hornet, many of them flying their first combat mission, who had changed the course of the war with their courage and skill. And there were the Japanese sailors and airmen floating in life rafts among the wreckage of their ships, watching 6 months of victories disappear beneath the waves. Many would not survive the long journey back to Japan, victims of exposure, thirst, and the vast indifference of the Pacific Ocean. The Battle of Midway was far from over. Fighting would continue for several more days as the Japanese attempted to salvage something from the disaster. But the decisive moment had already passed. In those 6 minutes between 10:22 and 10:28 a.m. on June 4, 1942, the tide of war in the Pacific had turned forever. Signals in the dark. While the drama of aerial combat captured the world's attention, another battle was being fought in the electronic realm. A battle of signals and silence, of radar screens and radio intercepts, where victory or defeat could hinge on the interpretation of a single blip on a glowing green screen. The radar station on Midway Island was housed in a low concrete building that had been designed to withstand the tropical storms that periodically swept across the Pacific. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of electronics and human sweat as operators hunched over their primitive but vital equipment, searching the skies for signs of approaching aircraft. Radar in 1942 was still a relatively new technology, and the equipment on Midway was far from sophisticated by later standards. The antenna rotated slowly on its mount, sending out pulses of radio energy that would bounce back from any metallic objects in their path. The returning signals appeared as bright spots on a circular cathode ray tube, but interpreting these signals required considerable skill and experience. Corporal Harold Thompson had been operating radar equipment for less than a year, but he had developed an almost intuitive understanding of what the glowing blips on his screen meant. He could distinguish between a single aircraft and a formation, could estimate altitude and bearing with remarkable accuracy, and had learned to filter out the false returns that were caused by weather conditions or flocks of birds. On the morning of June 4th, Thompson was the operator who first detected the incoming Japanese strike force. At 5:34 a.m., his screen suddenly filled with contacts, dozens of aircraft approaching from the northwest at high altitude and high speed. The formation was so large that it appeared as a solid mass of light on the radar screen, unlike anything Thompson had ever seen before. The warning that Thompson transmitted to the island's command post gave the defenders of Midway precious minutes to prepare for the attack. Fighter pilots ran to their aircraft. Anti-aircraft gunners loaded their weapons, and ground personnel took cover in the reinforced bunkers that had been prepared for this moment. Without radar, the Japanese attack would have achieved complete surprise. With it, the Americans had just enough warning to mount some semblance of defense. But radar was a double-edged sword. While it could detect incoming aircraft, it could also reveal the location of the radar station itself to enemy direction-finding equipment. Japanese intelligence had identified the approximate location of Midway's radar installation, and it was high on the target list for the morning attack. The bombing of the radar station was intense but not entirely successful. Several near misses damaged the antenna and shook the building's foundations, but the equipment continued to function. Thompson and his fellow operators remained at their posts throughout the attack, tracking the movements of both enemy and friendly aircraft, even as bombs exploded around their bunker. The information provided by radar was crucial not only for defense, but also for coordinating counterattacks. When American bombers took off from Midway to strike the Japanese carriers, radar operators provided them with the most current information about enemy positions and movements. This guidance was vital in the vast expanses of the Pacific, where a navigation error of just a few degrees could mean the difference between finding the target and flying off into empty ocean. The Japanese, despite their technological sophistication in many areas, had been slower to develop and deploy radar than their American opponents. Most Japanese ships in 1942 were equipped with primitive air search radars, but these were far less capable than the American systems. This technological gap would prove increasingly important as the war progressed. Aboard the American carriers, radar operators faced their own unique challenges. The ship's radars were more advanced than the land-based systems on Midway, but they operated in a much more demanding environment. The constant motion of the ship, the interference from the vessel's own electronics, and the need to coordinate with multiple aircraft made their job incredibly complex. Lieutenant Commander John Thach, leading a fighter squadron from the Yorktown, relied heavily on radar-directed intercepts to position his fighters for maximum effectiveness. The famous Thach Weave defensive formation that he had developed was designed to work in conjunction with radar guidance, allowing a small number of American fighters to engage larger formations of Japanese aircraft, with some hope of success. The radar operators aboard the Yorktown faced a particularly harrowing experience when their ship came under attack. As Japanese bombs exploded around the carrier, the men in the radar room continued to track incoming aircraft, providing vital information to the ship's fighter direction officers even as their own lives hung in the balance. One of the most crucial radar contacts of the entire battle came late in the afternoon, when operators aboard the Enterprise detected the final Japanese carrier, Hiryu, attempting to escape to the northwest. This contact allowed Admiral Spruance to launch the strike that would sink the last of Nagumo's carriers, completing the destruction of the Japanese mobile force. The electronic battle of Midway was fought by men whose names would never appear in the history books, whose contributions would remain largely unrecognized for decades. But their vigilance and skill were every bit as important as the courage of the pilots who flew into combat or the gunners who manned the anti-aircraft batteries. In the quiet, air-conditioned spaces where radar operators worked, the Battle of Midway was a different kind of conflict, a battle of information and interpretation where the ability to distinguish between a rain cloud and an enemy formation could determine the fate of nations. Awaiting the dawn, in the ready rooms of the American aircraft carriers, a different kind of tension pervaded the hours between combat missions. These spaces, cramped and utilitarian, served as the nerve centers where pilots received their briefings, studied their charts, and waited for the call to man their aircraft. The atmosphere was thick with cigarette smoke, nervous energy, and the quiet camaraderie that develops among men who face death together. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay sat in the ready room of Torpedo Squadron 6 aboard the Enterprise, studying photographs of the Japanese carriers that intelligence officers had managed to obtain from reconnaissance flights. At 38, Lindsay was older than most of his pilots, a career naval aviator who had spent years perfecting the dangerous art of torpedo attack. The TBD Devastator that Lindsay flew was already obsolete, a fact that every pilot in the squadron understood with painful clarity. The aircraft was slow, poorly armored, and required a straight and level approach to deliver its torpedo, making it an easy target for enemy fighters and anti-aircraft guns. Yet these men climbed into their cockpits mission after mission, knowing that their chances of survival were slim. The ready-room conversations before the morning strike were subdued, with pilots checking and rechecking their navigation calculations, discussing recognition signals, and reviewing emergency procedures. There was little of the bravado that Hollywood would later attribute to combat pilots. These men understood exactly what they were facing, and their quiet professionalism was far more impressive than any theatrical display of courage. Ensign Bert Ernest, one of the youngest pilots in the squadron, wrote a brief letter to his parents before the mission, a letter he hoped they would never have to read. The practice of writing last letters before combat missions was common among aircrew, though few spoke about it openly. These letters were usually kept by squadron mates, to be sent home only if the writer failed to return. The ship's chaplain, Lieutenant Commander Howell Forgy, moved quietly through the ready rooms, offering words of comfort and encouragement to any pilot who sought them. Forgy was not a combat participant in the traditional sense, but his presence was invaluable to men who were about to face the possibility of death, far from home and family. As the time for launch approached, the atmosphere in the ready rooms became increasingly focused. Pilots donned their flight gear: leather helmets, goggles, life jackets, and the bulky parachute harnesses that might mean the difference between life and death if their aircraft were shot down. The ritual of dressing for combat was performed with the same careful attention to detail that a surgeon might bring to preparing for a complex operation. The intelligence briefings were thorough but necessarily incomplete. The pilots knew approximately where the Japanese carriers were located, but the enemy's exact position, course, and speed could only be estimated. In the vast expanse of the Pacific, an error of just a few miles could mean the difference between finding the target and running out of fuel over empty ocean. Navigation over water was one of the most challenging aspects of carrier aviation. With no landmarks to guide them, pilots had to rely on dead reckoning, compass headings, and careful calculations of wind speed and direction. A slight error in any of these factors could send an entire squadron off course, leaving them lost and helpless when their fuel ran low. The camaraderie among the aircrew was evident in the small gestures and quiet conversations that filled the ready rooms. Pilots shared photographs of wives and girlfriends, discussed plans for after the war, and offered encouragement to squadron mates who were flying their first combat mission. There was an unspoken understanding that some of the men in that room would not return, but this knowledge seemed to strengthen rather than weaken the bonds between them. Lieutenant Commander John Thack, the fighter squadron commander, who would later become famous for his innovative tactics, spent the pre-mission time discussing strategy with his pilots. The F-4F Wildcat fighters they flew were outclassed by the Japanese Zero in speed and maneuverability, but Thack had developed tactics that could partially offset this disadvantage. The Thack Weave, as it would later be known, involved pairs of fighters working together in a coordinated defensive pattern. When attacked by superior numbers of enemy aircraft, the American pilots would cross back and forth in front of each other, allowing the trailing pilot to get shots at any enemy aircraft pursuing his wingman. It was a simple concept, but one that required precise timing and absolute trust between pilots. As the call to man aircraft echoed through the ship's loudspeakers, the conversations in the ready rooms gradually died away. Pilots gathered their charts, checked their equipment one final time, and headed for the flight deck. The transition from the relative safety of the ready room to the exposed flight deck was always jarring. Suddenly, the reality of combat became immediate and unavoidable. The flight deck of an aircraft carrier preparing to launch a strike was a scene of controlled chaos. Aircraft engines roared to life, sending clouds of blue exhaust smoke swirling across the deck. Flight deck crews, identifiable by their colored jerseys, moved with practiced efficiency around the warming aircraft. Plane handlers in blue, ordnance men in red, fuel handlers in purple, each group performing their specialized tasks in a complex ballet of preparation. The pilots climbed into their cockpits and began the familiar ritual of the pre-flight check. Engine temperatures, oil pressure, radio equipment, armament systems, each item was verified and confirmed before the aircraft could be cleared for takeoff. In the cramped confines of a fighter or bomber cockpit, every switch and gauge had to be within easy reach. Every control had to respond immediately to the pilot's commands. The vastness remains. As the smoke of battle gradually cleared over the waters near Midway, the Pacific Ocean began to reclaim its ancient dominion. The debris of war, pieces of aircraft, life rafts, oil slicks, and the personal effects of sailors and airmen drifted slowly across the surface of the sea, temporary intrusions on the vast blue expanse that had witnessed countless such conflicts over the millennia. From the perspective of the ocean itself, the Battle of Midway was merely a brief disturbance, no more significant than a tropical storm or the passage of a pod of whales. The Pacific had seen the rise and fall of civilizations, the migration of peoples across thousands of miles of open water, and the slow dance of geological forces that had created and destroyed entire island chains. Human warfare, for all its fury and consequence, was but a momentary ripple on the surface of deep time. Yet for those who floated in life rafts among the wreckage, the ocean's indifference was both terrifying and oddly comforting. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, spent nearly 10 hours in the water before being rescued. During those long hours, he witnessed the destruction of the Japanese carriers, saw the sun set over the battlefield, and contemplated his own mortality in the vast embrace of the Pacific. Gay later described the strange peace that came over him as he floated in his life jacket, watching the battle rage around him. The ocean that had seemed so hostile during the attack, filled with exploding shells, burning aircraft and sinking ships, gradually returned to its natural state of calm. The swells that had made torpedo attacks so difficult now cradled him gently, and the same wind that had scattered his squadron's formation now cooled his face as he waited for rescue. The Pacific Ocean covers more than 63 million square miles, containing more water than all the other oceans combined. Its deepest point, the Challenger Deep in the Mariana Trench, plunges to depths of nearly 36,000 feet, deep enough to swallow Mount Everest with room to spare. In such an immense body of water, the largest naval battle in history occupied an area no bigger than a small lake. The ocean's memory is both long and short. The physical evidence of the battle, the sunken ships, the scattered debris, the oil slicks, would disappear within days or weeks, consumed by the sea's vast appetite for dissolution, but the consequences of those few hours of combat would ripple outward like waves from a stone dropped in still water, affecting the lives of millions of people across the Pacific and beyond. Marine biologists estimate that the Pacific Ocean contains more than 25,000 islands, most of them uninhabited specks of coral or volcanic rock that appear on no charts and bear no names. Midway itself was such a place until human navigation and commerce gave it strategic importance. The island's significance lay not in its intrinsic value. It was, after all, little more than a coral atoll with a few thousand seabirds, but in its position relative to other human settlements and shipping lanes. The currents of the Pacific follow patterns established over millions of years, great circular flows of water that carry nutrients, marine life, and human artifacts across vast distances. The wreckage of the Battle of Midway would be dispersed by these currents, some pieces washing ashore on distant beaches months or years later, others sinking to the abyssal depths where they would rest undisturbed for centuries. The Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu now rest on the ocean floor at depths of more than 17,000 feet, their hulls slowly being consumed by the corrosive effects of salt water and the patient work of deep-sea organisms. The aircraft that went down with them, the personal effects of their crews, and the weapons they carried have become part of the ocean's archaeological record, joining countless other vessels that have been claimed by the sea over the centuries. The USS Yorktown, damaged in the battle and finally sunk by a Japanese submarine 2 days later, lies in even deeper water. Nearly 17,000 feet down, her flight deck crushed by the enormous pressure, but her basic structure still recognizable to the deep-sea explorers who found her in 1998. The carrier has become an artificial reef, providing habitat for deep-sea creatures that have never known sunlight. For the families of the men who died in the battle, the ocean's vastness represented both closure and eternal uncertainty. Bodies that were never recovered had been claimed by the sea, given a burial more profound and permanent than any human ceremony could provide. Yet the lack of physical remains, of graves to visit and monuments to touch, made the grieving process more difficult for those left behind. The Pacific's role in human history extends far beyond any single battle or war. For thousands of years, Polynesian navigators crossed these waters in outrigger canoes, using their knowledge of currents, winds, and star patterns to find tiny islands scattered across millions of square miles of ocean. Their voyages of discovery and settlement were no less remarkable than the naval campaigns of the 20th century, and far more enduring in their consequences. The ocean that had witnessed the Battle of Midway continued its ancient rhythms, indifferent to human conflict, but essential to human survival. The same thermal currents that had influenced the flight paths of combat aircraft also drove the weather patterns that brought rain to distant continents. The same vast expanses that had challenged naval strategists also provided highways for commerce and communication between nations. Silent hunters. Beneath the surface drama of aerial combat, another kind of warfare was being waged in the depths of the Pacific. American submarines, those silent hunters of the deep, played a crucial but largely unsung role in the Battle of Midway, their contributions hidden beneath thousands of feet of dark water and layers of military secrecy that would persist for decades. The USS Nautilus, a diesel-electric submarine under the command of Lieutenant Commander William Brockman, had been patrolling the waters northwest of Midway for several days before the battle began. Submarines in 1942 were primitive by later standards, cramped, uncomfortable vessels that could remain submerged for only limited periods before their batteries were exhausted and they had to surface to run their diesel engines. Life aboard a submarine was a unique form of military service, requiring men to live and work in spaces so confined that privacy was impossible and personal hygiene was a constant challenge. The air inside a submerged submarine was thick with the smell of diesel fuel, cooking food, unwashed bodies, and the chemical reactions of the batteries that powered the vessel's electric motors. On the morning of June 4th, Brockman brought the Nautilus to periscope depth, just as the Japanese carriers were launching their first strike against Midway. Through the submarine's periscope, a device no more sophisticated than a telescope with mirrors, he could see the enemy fleet spread out across the horizon, a sight that few American military personnel had witnessed and lived to describe. The view through a submarine periscope was both intimate and distant, like watching a movie through a keyhole. Brockman could see individual aircraft taking off from the carriers, could observe the movements of escort vessels, and could estimate the course and speed of the enemy fleet. But he was also acutely aware of his own vulnerability. If the submarine were detected, it would face destruction from depth charges dropped by Japanese destroyers. The Nautilus attempted to attack the Japanese carriers, but the enemy's escort vessels quickly detected the submarine's presence and forced it to dive deep to avoid destruction. For the next several hours, Brockman and his crew endured a terrifying depth charge attack, their submarine shaking and groaning under the impact of underwater explosions that seemed close enough to crush the hull. The psychological strain of depth charge attacks was enormous. The crew could hear the enemy destroyers passing overhead, their propellers creating a distinctive sound that every submariner learned to recognize and fear. The depth charges themselves produced a sound like thunder, followed by the metallic groaning of the submarine's hull as it absorbed the shockwaves. During these attacks, submarine crews were required to remain absolutely silent, communicating only through hand signals and whispered commands. Any unnecessary noise, a dropped wrench, a cough, even the sound of footsteps, could potentially be detected by enemy sonar operators and reveal the submarine's exact location. Men stood motionless at their stations for hours, hardly daring to breathe as death prowled the waters above them. The Nautilus survived the depth charge attack and eventually surfaced to find the battle raging around her. Brockman's radio reports provided valuable intelligence to Admiral Nimitz and his staff, confirming the position and composition of the Japanese fleet and reporting the damage inflicted by American air attacks. Other American submarines were positioned along the expected route of Japanese withdrawal, hoping to intercept damaged enemy vessels attempting to escape. The USS Tambor, commanded by Lieutenant Commander John Murphy, was patrolling to the west of Midway when she encountered a group of Japanese cruisers in the early morning hours of June 5th. The submarine's presence, though she was unable to attack successfully, caused the Japanese ships to take evasive action in the darkness. During these frantic maneuvers, two of the cruisers, Mogami and Mikuma, collided with each other, causing severe damage that would eventually lead to Mikuma's sinking and leave Mogami crippled and vulnerable to air attack. The submarine war in the Pacific was characterized by long periods of monotonous patrol duty, punctuated by moments of intense terror and excitement. Crews might spend weeks at sea without sighting an enemy vessel, living on canned food and recycled air, their only entertainment the books and magazines they had brought with them, or the card games and conversations that helped pass the endless hours. The technical challenges of submarine warfare were immense. Navigation beneath the surface relied on dead reckoning and careful calculation, since radio signals could not penetrate more than a few feet of seawater. Submarines had to surface regularly to fix their position using celestial navigation, exposing themselves to detection by enemy aircraft or surface vessels. The torpedoes carried by American submarines in 1942 were notoriously unreliable, plagued by defective magnetic detonators and depth-keeping mechanisms that often caused them to miss their targets or fail to explode even when they hit. Many submarine commanders reported successful attacks that later proved to have caused no damage, leading to frustration and doubt about their weapons' effectiveness. Despite these technical problems, American submarines played an increasingly important role in the Pacific War. sinking merchant vessels that carried vital supplies to Japanese forces and gathering intelligence about enemy movements and capabilities. The men who served aboard these vessels were volunteers, attracted by the higher pay and faster promotions available in the submarine service, but also by the unique challenges and camaraderie of undersea warfare. Night falls on Midway. As darkness settled over Midway Island on the evening of June 4, 1942, an eerie quiet descended upon the small coral atoll that had been the center of such violent action just hours earlier. The smoke from burning buildings and fuel storage tanks continued to rise into the tropical night, creating ghostly columns that were visible for miles across the dark Pacific. The island's defenders, exhausted from a day of combat that had tested their courage and endurance to the limit, began the grim task of assessing their losses and preparing for what many believed would be another attack at dawn. Medical personnel worked by the light of kerosene lanterns and flashlights, treating the wounded in makeshift aid stations that had been set up in any building that remained intact. Major Floyd Parks walked the perimeter of his small command, checking on his Marines and sailors, offering words of encouragement and trying to maintain morale despite the devastating losses his forces had suffered. Of the 26 fighters that had taken off that morning to intercept the Japanese attack, only 2 remained in flyable condition. The island's bomber force had been similarly decimated, with most aircraft either shot down over the ocean or destroyed on the ground. Yet there was also a sense of cautious optimism among the defenders. Radio reports from the American carriers indicated that the Japanese had suffered catastrophic losses, with all 4 of their aircraft carriers either sunk or sinking. If these reports were accurate, and if no additional enemy forces were approaching, Midway might have survived the greatest test in its brief military history. The island's radar operators maintained their vigilant watch throughout the night, their screens sweeping the surrounding ocean for any sign of approaching aircraft. The radar equipment had been damaged during the morning attack, but repair crews had managed to restore most of its capability. The green glow of the radar screen provided a small circle of electronic light in the darkened operations bunker, where tired operators strained their eyes for the telltale blips that would indicate another attack. The night sky over Midway was spectacular, unmarred by the light pollution that characterized more populated areas of the world. The Southern Cross hung low on the horizon, while the Milky Way stretched across the heavens like a river of stars. For men who had spent the day surrounded by the noise and violence of modern warfare, the ancient patterns of the stars provided a reminder of permanence and continuity that transcended human conflict. Corporal James Patterson, a Marine machine gunner whose position had been overrun during the morning attack, sat in a foxhole overlooking the lagoon and tried to process what he had experienced. At 19, Patterson had never been in combat before, had never seen men die, had never faced the possibility of his own death with such immediacy. The events of the day seemed almost surreal, like scenes from a movie rather than memories of his own experience. The island's birds, which had been scattered by the bombing and strafing attacks, began to return as darkness fell. Laysan albatrosses, with their remarkable ability to navigate across thousands of miles of open ocean, settled back onto their nesting areas with the same calm indifference they had shown to human presence for generations. The birds seemed to understand, in some instinctive way, that the immediate danger had passed and that their island home would continue to exist despite the temporary violence that had disturbed its peace. In the communications center, radio operators maintained contact with Pearl Harbor and the American carrier forces, sending and receiving messages that would help coordinate the next phase of operations. The radio equipment, like most of the island's vital systems, had been damaged but not destroyed in the morning attack. Repair crews had worked throughout the day to restore communications, knowing that Midway's isolation made radio contact with the outside world essential for survival. The wounded were evacuated to the island's small hospital, where Navy medical personnel worked with limited supplies and equipment to save as many lives as possible. The hospital itself had been damaged in the attack, with several wards destroyed and much of the medical equipment lost. But the medical staff improvised with whatever materials they could find, performing surgery by flashlight and treating wounds with bandages made from torn clothing. The sound of waves lapping against Midway's coral shores provided a constant soothing background to the night's activities. The ocean that had brought the Japanese attackers to the island's doorstep also offered the promise of rescue and reinforcement, carrying American ships and aircraft toward what might be the final confrontation of the battle. As the night progressed, reports continued to arrive from the scattered survivors of the day's air battles. Pilots who had been shot down were being rescued from life rafts by American destroyers and submarines. Each rescue brought not only relief for the individual airmen, but also valuable intelligence about the effectiveness of the attacks and the condition of enemy forces. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human struggle, but somehow comforting in their predictability. Men who had faced death that day found solace in the familiar constellations, in the knowledge that these same stars had watched over countless other battles, other victories and defeats, other young men far from home who had looked up at the night sky and wondered if they would live to see another dawn. Echoes on the shore. In the quiet hours before dawn on June 5th, as the first pale light began to appear on the eastern horizon, the full magnitude of what had occurred at Midway began to become clear. The Battle of Midway was over, though scattered fighting would continue for several more days as Japanese forces attempted to salvage something from the disaster that had befallen their fleet. The strategic implications of the American victory were enormous, though it would take time for military analysts and historians to fully understand what had taken place in those crucial hours on June the 4th. In the space of a single day, the balance of naval power in the Pacific had shifted decisively in favor of the United States. The Japanese combined fleet, which had seemed invincible just 24 hours earlier, had lost the heart of its striking power. The human cost of the victory was sobering. American losses included the carrier Yorktown, the destroyer Hammond, 147 aircraft, and 307 military personnel. These numbers seemed almost modest compared to Japanese losses. 4 aircraft carriers, a heavy cruiser, 248 aircraft, and approximately 3,057 personnel. But each number represented individual stories of courage, sacrifice, and loss that would echo through families and communities for generations. On Midway itself, the work of recovery and rebuilding began almost immediately. Construction crews arrived within days to repair the damaged runways, replace destroyed buildings, and restore the island's capability as a forward base for American operations in the Central Pacific. The coral that had been blasted from the runways was carefully collected and reused, mixed with concrete and steel to create structures that were stronger than before. The island's bird population, which had been temporarily disrupted by the battle, gradually returned to normal patterns of behavior. The albatrosses, frigate birds, and boobies that called Midway home seemed to understand, in their ancient wisdom, that human conflicts were temporary disturbances in the longer rhythms of life on their remote atoll. Within weeks, the birds were nesting again, in areas that had been cratered by bombs, their presence a reminder of continuity and resilience. The strategic lessons of Midway would influence naval warfare for decades to come. The battle had demonstrated the decisive importance of intelligence, the vulnerability of surface ships to air attack, and the crucial role of timing and coordination in naval operations. Most importantly, it had shown that technological superiority and numerical advantage could be overcome by superior planning, better intelligence, and the courage of individual warriors. The codebreakers who had made the victory possible remained anonymous for many years after the war, their contributions hidden by the requirements of military secrecy. Joseph Rochefort and his team at Pearl Harbor had provided the intelligence that allowed Admiral Nimitz to position his forces for maximum effectiveness, but their role would not be fully recognized until decades later. The pilots who had flown into combat on June 4th became the heroes of a grateful nation, though many of them did not live to see the war's end. The men of Torpedo Squadron 8, who had sacrificed their lives in a futile attack that nonetheless contributed to the overall victory, were posthumously awarded the Navy Cross and became symbols of American courage and determination. The Japanese survivors of the battle faced a different kind of challenge, returning to a homeland that was not yet ready to accept the reality of defeat. The loss of the 4 carriers was initially kept secret from the Japanese public, and many of the surviving pilots and sailors were reassigned to quiet posts where they would not be able to discuss their experiences. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Japan's naval strategy, understood immediately that the defeat at Midway had doomed his country's hopes for victory in the Pacific. Though fighting would continue for more than 3 years, Japan would never again possess the naval aviation capability that had made her early victories possible. The experienced pilots who had died in the flames of the carriers could not be replaced, and Japan's industrial capacity was insufficient to build new carriers fast enough to match American production. The waters around Midway returned to their natural state of calm, the debris of battle gradually dispersing across the vast Pacific. But the memory of what had occurred there would endure, preserved in official histories, personal memoirs, and the stories passed down through families whose loved ones had participated in the battle. Today, Midway Atoll is a national wildlife refuge, home to millions of seabirds and a few dozen human caretakers who maintain the facilities and protect the island's natural heritage. Visitors to Midway can still see remnants of the battle: concrete bunkers, pieces of aircraft, and the simple memorials that honor those who fought and died there. The waves continue to lap against Midway's coral shores, carrying the same rhythm they have maintained for thousands of years. The sound is peaceful, eternal, a reminder that the ocean, which witnessed one of history's most decisive battles, continues its ancient dialogue with the land, indifferent to human ambition, but somehow comforting in its permanence. In that gentle sound of waves on coral sand, we can hear the echoes of all those who served at Midway: the pilots who flew into impossible odds, the sailors who fought their ships with desperate courage, the Marines and soldiers who defended their small piece of the Pacific with everything they had. Their sacrifice ensured that the ideals they fought for would survive, that freedom would endure, and that future generations would inherit a world where such courage would be remembered and honored. The Battle of Midway reminds us that history's greatest victories often come not from overwhelming force or superior numbers, but from the combination of intelligence, courage, and the willingness of ordinary people to do extraordinary things when their cause is just. In the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, on a tiny coral atoll thousands of miles from anywhere, a few thousand Americans changed the course of history and preserved the hope of freedom for generations yet to come. And so the waves continue their eternal rhythm against the shores of Midway, carrying with them the memory of those who served, the echo of their courage, and the promise that their sacrifice will never be forgotten. In that gentle, persistent sound, we find both peace and remembrance, the perfect ending to a story of heroism that will endure as long as the ocean itself.